Civil war, warlords, famine, pirates. All images most commonly associated with Somalia in people's minds. The country, once labeled the Switzerland of Africa, has suffered a steady and tragic decline for decades. But beneath the prolonged suffering and chaos is a land rich in history and heritage, and a people struggling to maintain a semblance of normality in the absence of a state. In the Horn of Africa, Somalia is the continent's most easterly country. It has the longest coastline in mainland Africa, stretching more than 3,000 kilometers along the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Aden, and the Red Sea. Its location turned Somalia into a strategically important trading center in the ancient world. But the history of Somalia dates back much further, to some of the earliest human settlements in the world. These cave images of a life of herding in the Lasgil wall paintings in northwestern Somalia are estimated to date back between 3,000 and 6,000 years BCE. They're the first chapter in Somalia's now largely forgotten story.
We're just known for being skinny and pirates. We're not known for having, a strong history, a strong culture. We're not known for the things that we know ourselves about. They're probably not even known by Somalis. You can walk around here and see the history of just this town itself. We have a very, very deep and long history that even Somalis are unaware of, and that's a shame, I think.
If you look at the orange, and you say, well, this has sort of blemishes, okay? So it might not taste too well, so you can throw it away. But if you actually take the husk out and you look, there are no blemishes inside, and it's sweet and juicy, okay? And so if you look at what has happened to the Somali people, the tragedy that has befallen them in the last 25 years or so, so these people are sort of a rubbish, okay? But if you go to Mogadishu, if you go to Hargeisa, if you go to Garawa, if you go to Kismaayo, and you go to schools that ordinary people have put together, those young and women in those schools are more eager to learn than my students here at the University of Minnesota.
Somalia is emerging from a very long, difficult period, and we are now moving away from the chaos, instability, extremism, piracy to an era of peaceful and development.
Around 12 million Somalis, most of them herders, farmers, and fishermen, live in the country's 600,000 square kilometers. Despite being a member of the Arab League, Somalia's main language is Somali. The only Arabic speakers are people who've studied the language or lived in Arab countries.
It always makes me very cross when I hear some official somewhere saying Syria is the next Somalia, or Libya is the next Somalia, or Aleppo is Mogadishu. But you hear that. Somalia's become a catchword for the most disastrous, chaotic, violent, terrible state.
With the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, Somalia's strategic location became even more significant. Being at the intersection of Africa and Asia did not go unnoticed in the West. In 1884, the United States and 13 European countries met in Berlin, their aim to divide the African continent between them. They divided what we know as Somalia into 3 provinces, each ruled by a different European country. British Somalia, Italian Somalia, and French Somalia. The mainly Somali region of Ogaden was taken by the Ethiopian Empire and the NFD by Kenya.
The incredible thing about Somalia is that if you go way back in its history, it's always been either fought over or had foreign powers intervening in some way.
Both British and Italian Somalia gained independence in 1960. French Somalia voted to remain under French rule, despite accusations of ballot rigging, but later voted firmly for independence in 1977 and became Djibouti. The former British and Italian territories immediately united, forming Greater Somalia on the 1st of January 1960. Somalis elected Adam Abdullah Othman as the first president of the united country. He ruled for 7 years and was succeeded after a free and peaceful election by Abdel Rashid Ali Sharmarka. This was when Somalia's peace and stability earned it the nickname the Switzerland of Africa. However, corruption was rife and frustration began to mount. Sharmarka ruled for 2 years, but he was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards on the 15th of October 1969 and succeeded by Prime Minister Mukhtar Mohammed Hussein. He ruled for just 6 days before being overthrown in a military coup. It was led by General Siad Barre, who would be the dominant figure in Somalia for the next 2 decades. Somalia's experiment in democracy was over. The rifle, not the ballot box, would now govern the country. Barre dissolved parliament, suspended the constitution, banned political parties, arrested politicians, and limited press freedom.
We had only accepted the...
And then from that on, there was a downward trend in Somalia, everything, up to the end, up to the disintegration. And every time things were going down, the military regime was becoming more brutal and more dictator.
So people were arrested, properties were confiscated without compensation. Any ship that brings material to Berbera, the materials on that ship were confiscated by the Siad Barre regime with no compensation. So things were getting worse and worse.
Barre's government was supported by the 2 superpowers of the day, the United States and the Soviet Union. It built the country's infrastructure and radically improved literacy. But in 1977, Barre made a move to take the Ogaden region, which was majority Somali, from his neighbor, Ethiopia.
I think what the Ogaden War was about was actually staking a claim to a more realistic border which did not comply with the colonial border. The colonial border was the line across the map. The real border was what the Somalis tried to establish. And of course, you remember, it was a very strange war because Siad Barre pretended that it was not a war being fought by the Somali army, but was being fought by the Western Somali Liberation Front, which didn't really exist at all. I mean, we went out to try and find the Western Somali Liberation Front, and we discovered, of course, that their tanks, their armored cars, were all Somali military vehicles with just a bit of paint on them saying WSLF. So the whole thing was a fiction. Of course, what was a fact was that the Somalis wanted their territory, wanted what was naturally, organically Somalia. But Siad Barre did not want to be seen to be fighting for that himself.
Jon Snow, News at 10, Jig Jigger.
However, the Somali army was forced to withdraw when the Soviet Union sided with Ethiopia in the conflict.
The army came back, demoralized, defeated, after they felt they were victorious. That was when the Somalis' nationalism became something of the past. Clans came up, warlords came up, other factions came up, religious groups came up.
Opposition to the military government increased. Encouraged by Ethiopia, tribes in the north rejected Barre's dictatorship. He turned his rockets and warplanes on them and attacked Hargeisa, the capital of former British Somalia, in May 1988, killing thousands of northern Somalis. In 1991, the southern and northern tribes, armed by Ethiopia, moved to overthrow Barre. The general's grip on power had weakened, and his allies had abandoned him.
By the time the government fell at the end in 1991, neither the Soviet Union nor the United States was backing Siad Barre. They both had given up on him.
Even if Siad Barre tried over those decades of rule to ban the clan, what happened to Siad Barre was that he eventually actually used clan politics to try to dominate the whole territory, and he marginalized some clans and promoted others. So the way in which he eventually fell from power was clans rose up against him and kicked him out.
Former British Somalia declared its independence from Greater Somalia. It calls itself the Republic of Somaliland, but has little international recognition even today. The rest, what had been Italian Somalia, became the Federal Republic of Somalia. Siad Barre was gone. Ali Mahdi became temporary president, but was opposed by General Muhammad Farah Hadid. The two fought for 4 months. A ceasefire was agreed, but the civil war continues today.
If Siad Barre was to leave power 2 years earlier and said, now Somalis, you have to organize new elections and I will be happy to leave, none of this would have happened. But when he brutalized different groups of people in different regions of the country, people were just literally mindlessly wants to get rid of him. But they never thought of what was going to come. And the leaders who were leading them against Siad Barre were singing the music of sectarianism rather than sort of the music of commonality and brotherhood.
I think most people in the international community believe that Somalia became a failed state in 1991 with the collapse of the Siad Barre government, which had been in power since 1969. And many governments have failed around the world. That is not unique. However, in this case, there was no replacement government.
I usually use the word collapsed state rather than a failed state, in large measure because it's the government that has collapsed rather than the state of affairs for the whole country. This is a country at one point that was the best democratic country in Africa. Now it has become, in a sense, the worst because there has been no government in place for 25 years. And so the absence of government means there are no public schools, there are no public security services, there are no public health facilities, there are no public sort of environmental protection, there are no infrastructure that's being built by the state. So the absence of the state means that the government has collapsed, but society is trying to make a life in the midst of that madness.
Because of the nature of the Somali people, And because the fact that they have been a nation prior to the formation of the state, the modern state system has collapsed. But the nation itself did not collapse. And the people have managed to an extent that it has been documented, it has been talked about, it has been elaborated. The case that Somalia is teaching, well, presumably that they can live without a state. So I think they have shown something totally different than what was expected to come out.
Maybe Somalia has had a failed political system, failed government, but it's not a failed society. So many things work in Somalia better than they do in lots of other countries. They have one of the most cheap and efficient telecommunication systems in the world. Their remittance system is incredible. You can pay mobile payments in Somalia that you can't do here. You can go to get your petrol, you just pay by your phone. It's very sophisticated and successful in lots of ways. So I think it's wrong to call it a failed state.
To have a state is important because now anybody can come to the country, whatever name they come, whether they are coming for Operation Restore Hope, whether they are coming for Amazon Africans looking for the peace, and whichever name they come in. The good thing about the state is state controls the security of the country. But the good thing about being a Somali is that despite all that, they have exhibited remarkable resilience and work and dynamics.
The civil war caused widespread famine. The UN sent humanitarian aid, but both the famine and the civil war dragged on. Somalia was unable to prevent foreign forces entering the conflict.
Imagine 7,000 tons of food aid literally bursting out of a warehouse on a dock in Mogadishu, while Somalis starve less than a kilometer away because relief workers cannot run the gauntlet of armed gangs roving the city. Confronted with these conditions, relief groups called for outside troops to provide security so they could feed people. It's now clear that military support is necessary to ensure the safe delivery of the food Somalis need to survive.
So in December 1992, the US launched a military operation on the pretext of protecting the UN humanitarian effort. In 1993, US forces tried to capture self-proclaimed President Adid, resulting in the Battle of Mogadishu. But the operation failed. 2 American helicopters were shot down and their crews dragged through the streets. Around 1,000 Somalis and 18 Americans were killed in the violence.
This past weekend, we all reacted with anger and horror as an armed Somali gang desecrated the bodies of our American soldiers and displayed a captured American pilot. All of them soldiers who were taking part in an international effort to end the starvation of the Somali people themselves. These tragic events raise hard questions about our effort in Somalia. When will our people come home?
American troops had withdrawn from Somalia by March 1994. Fighting continued between the rival Somali militias as they splintered into more and more different factions. In 2004, a US-backed transitional government was formed, but it ran into opposition from the Islamic Courts Union, the ICU. This was a group of Sharia courts that united to form a rival government. It made major gains in 2006, taking control of almost the entire south of the country, including the capital, Mogadishu. It also reopened the air and seaports after over a decade. Ethiopia intervened to prop up the transitional government. It managed to roll back the Islamic Courts Union and finally retook Mogadishu in December 2006. The ICU was weakened and forced to the south. 2007, the UN deployed a combined African Union peacekeeping force called AMISOM. Ethiopia sent in its own troops, along with those of the African Union. But AMISOM's reputation suffered when Human Rights Watch accused it of several abuses, including sexual assault and civilian killings. This reinforced the view of many Somalis that AMISOM was an invading force, an occupation by stealth. They also saw Ethiopia as funding clans and sub-clans to sow division and prolong the conflict. As the ICU became marginalized, a more radical splinter group emerged, Al-Shabaab. Prepared to use violence, it took control of vast swathes of the south of Somalia.
ilaahay isku xiran oo ilaahay rumaysan oo kitaabkiisa isugu imaanay marka qofka muslimka waa wax laga rabo gaar ahaan laakiin amalka maanta aan ku jirno anaga gurigeenaba nologu yimi oo waa nalagu soo duulay anagoon idna aadin maanta aniga kuma duulin Ethiopia kuma duulin aniga Kenya kuma duulin aniga waxaan joogaa masqat raasi meeshaan ku dhashay baa joogaa oo la igu imaanaya oo la igu dulminaya marxaladda tan aniga waxaan iska difaacaya oo aan iska celinaya cadow igu soo duulay oo banaanka iga
The areas under Al-Shabaab control became more stable. But in 2011, a foreign power intervened again, this time Kenya. More than half a century on from independence, Somalia was once again at the mercy of a foreign army. Coming up in part 2, Somalis turned to piracy to protect their rich waters from illegal fishing.
A group of youngsters in a little village in Puntland, fed up with the activities of these illegal fishing companies, boarded a ship one day to protest. And they were told, what do you need to go away? They were given money. That was how it began.
When Somalia freed itself from colonial rule in 1960, its future seemed bright. It was peaceful and stable, had free and fair elections, and its geographical position in the world was commercially important. But when Siad Barre's 22-year dictatorship ended in 1991, the country was plunged into an interminable civil war. A UN peacekeeping force called AMISOM was deployed, but it was accused of abusing its powers, and its reputation plummeted. The presence of foreign forces was a problem for many Somalis, and the constant conflict also badly affected the economy.
Example, cabbage iyo tamaandhada. Anako imika intan halkan ka hore mid baa iga baxday halkan imkaan joogno dhinaceedan yaa iga baxday anigoo le maanta dhilkii fakhriga tuuraysa wada intan ku baxday ayaa marka 10kii saxarood hore 100,000 layga siistay ayaa waxa la soo rogay intaasoo kamiyo oo baabuuro laga keenay Ethiopia ayaa la keenay ya 40 bay ku dhacay ya ilaa markii dambe daadin ba ay gaadho suuqa lagu daadiyo la yiri waaba liibsan waayba marka doraado kala geyso maanta tu cusub timaado taadi casaaday cidmadeyso hadaba suuqyada caynkaas ee dilayana meesha way ku jiraan ya dalkii oo dhaqaale lahayn iyo dawladii oo la ictiraafsanayn oo hay'adaha yar wax la soo mariyo mooyaane aanay jirinna iyaduna way jirtaa kolka duruufaha caynkaas ayaa nagu xeeran.
The food supplied by aid agencies was sometimes unfit for human consumption. Some saw the West as simply offloading excess produce rather than providing genuine help. But Somali fishermen also had problems. Foreign vessels began encroaching on their waters, leading to an even more dangerous development: piracy.
ha ahaatee iskaashatooyinka dhibaatooyinkoodu ma yara mar dhexe oo burburkii markii uu dhacay kadib waxaa dhacday markii dadka kalluumaysatada ay baddii ay ku nabadgeli waayeen oo maraakiib shisheeye oo kalluumaysi sharci darraa baddeenna ku haya ay qalabkii kalluumaysiga ay baabi'iyeen oo doonyihii ay jejebiyeen oo dadkii ay biyo kuleel ay ku shubeen waxay khasab ku noqotay dadka kalluumaysatada inay iska difaacaan maraakiibtaas sharci darrada ku kalluumaysanaysa markeedii ugu horreysay maraakiibta kalluumaysiga la qabtay dad oo gadooday oo shabaagtoodii la baabi'iyey oo maslaxaddoodii badda la burburiyey ayaa waxay goosteen inay ka dagaalamaan oo ay ka dhiidhiyaan markaasna waxaa ka dhalatay burcad badeednimadii ka dhalatay meesha ugu horreysay burcad badeednimo ay ka dhalatay waxay ahaaday dhinaca badda cas.
This was once a bustling location. It's fantastic. It all started for me when I went to a region in Somaliland called Sanag, and a little village, a little fishing village on the coast where my family came from. The first time I went there, it was wonderful, obviously. I only saw what people wanted me to see. But as I started to go there on a regular basis, annually, I noticed that the fishermen and their activity was getting less and less and less and less. And I noticed at the same time that in the far horizon, there would be these big foreign boats, motherships, with their little tenders crawling around the sea, scooping up all the fish. The activity of the Somalilanders getting less and less easy. And at the same time, what was happening was the growth of piracy on the Somali coast. And that was the headline news, the piracy, the Somali pirates. A group of youngsters in a little village in Puntland, and they fed up with the activities of these illegal fishery companies, boarded a ship one day to protest, and they were told, what do you need to go away? They were given money. That was how it began. And of course it then escalated into a proper long-term business with many people benefiting from.
ay ku faafto wadankii iyo adduun weynaha ay ku faafto dhibaatada ka dhalatay kalluumaysiga sharci darrada markeedii hore adduunkaas soo gurmaday maraakiib oo dagaala la keenay oo lagula difaacid ay difaacayeen burcadnimada difaacayeen inay maraakiibtooda ay difaacanayaan hadda ay ku difaacanayaan baddeena inay ka xaalufiyaan kalluunka إلى الآن واسعة أرنتاس وكجران مراكب شرع دردا بدأ وكجران.
International community talks about Somali pirates. There are 4 kinds of pirates if you study this. And the most costly pirates are not the Somalis who hijack the ships, are the Italians, the Spaniards, the Belgians, the sort of Chinese, the Indians, the Tanzanians, the Egyptians, and everybody else who is looting the Somali waters. And guess how much they take away every year in free fish? $500 million every year. And so the country is big enough and rich enough to be able to provide a decent livelihood for all of its citizens if it's managed properly. But the international community, neighbors, don't want Somalia to stand on its toes. They want Somalis to be needy and to be beggars.
dhibaatooyin kale oo hadda maanta aan sheeganayno oo aan ahayn in dhibaatada iska ku badan tahay xeebihii oo aadan meesha rabtood u kalluumaysan karin midii aan markaas u dhadhoweyn oo amnigeeda iyo aan islahayn waxaad la imaadaan khayraadka keensataan waa idinku soconayaa ama waxtar baa ku helaysaan yacni ayadan xoogaa dhibaatooyin noocaan ah ka jira
dhibaatadii haysay dadkii kalluumaysatada hobyo uga soo cararay dhibaatada kalluumaysiga lagu haayo oo sida burcad badannimada iyo maraakiibtan shisheeye ay maxay ahaato soo miciin bideen gobolkan banaadir iyo magaalada muqdisho agagaarkeeda inay macnaha ka kalluumaystaan isla dhibaatadii ay ka soo carareen misna ay kula dhacday isla magaalada muqdisho waxaan taasoo aan ka xusi karno markii taariikhdu ahayd 14 bishan 12aad 2015 habeenkii waxaa la soo kaciyay 7 saac habeenimo ama kowda sida loo yaqaan qofba ay u taqaano taleefanka lagu soo kaciyay waxaa la dhahay doona badda lagu dhibaateeyay oo dooyinka badda lagu xabadeeyay doon ka mid ah waxaa gaaray dhibaato xoog leh gaartay
marka niyow taariikhdu markay ahayd 12ka bishii 12aad 14keeda maalinta ahayd baan halkan ka dhaqaaqnay 4 galabnimo habeenkii waxaan tagnay meel la yiraahdo Cilmacaan Maqribadii halkaasaan shabaageena soo dhiganay dabaysho si xawliyo sare ku socotay waxaan ka soo dhacnay koonfur adiga magaalada Muqdisho dusheeda sare airportka halkaasna waxaan kula kulannay annagoo aan shaqo ku jirnay isla habeennimadii layrarkii wax noo shidan shabaageena guranayno rasaasayn markii hore yani annaguna wax dakana ama wax tuhna laguma jirin iyo dareena waxaan dareen
daacadda adiga aniga abad oo yoolbaar camal ama dabajax camal macna hoos loogu soo dhig kura waxba duu socotay saacadda xoogayaan dal joogna marka halkan baad abad ku dhacday abadda meesha markay ku dhacday doonta waa ka boodnay hadii saa u dabaalanay wiilkii kale shabaab ku dhigay oo qabsaday anigana 9 saac goortay taa doon iska socoto ayaga soo qaad badda dhaxdeeda waxaad xabtay mid ay doontii soo qaadeen doontii meeshaan uga mid iyadoo duleesho hadii uga mid macnaha doontii banaanka la soo saaraba
soo annaga aan amaan helnay oo alxamdulillah ilaahay waxna gaarsiin saacado kooban annagoo shaqadii aan hawshii aan wadanay aan fududeynayno ayaan hawsheen ilaahay noo fududeeyay soo boobsiisanay
shabaagtiina ilaa waaga waa naga maqan tahay oo ilaa maalinta ay shaqo noogu dambaysay ilaa waaga adiga ilaa 7 maalmood ma shaqaysan qalabka aan ku shaqaysanayna waa naga maqan yahay doontina halkaanayda macnaha rasu oo jeedo waxa oo ku yaal rasaas
xoog leh gaartay marka subaxdii aan soo kacayna waxaan ka bilownay inaan marineska aan wargelino iyo wasaaradda kalluumaysiga aan wargelino dhibaatadaas isla magaalada Muqdisho kula dhacday taasna aad aan uga xunnahay haddaan nahay mas'uuliyiinta iskaashatooyinka kalluumaysiga aad aan uga xunnahay aad aan uga xunnahay cid kasta oo wax ka qaban kartana waxaan ka codsanaynaa inay arrintan wax ka qabtaan oo zoonaha laga kalluumaysto iyo zoonaha laga ilaaliyo oo nawaaxigan la cadeeyo in la cadeeyo maxay ahaato zoonaha laga ilaaliyo dekedda iyo airportka iyo zoonaha kalluumaysiga in la kala saaro oo warcad oo bayaan cad laga soo intaan soo dhaafina in la yiraahdo dadka kalluumaystada intaasaan dhihi lahaa
The piracy problem has largely ended, and as a result, you're now starting to see the return of some of the illegal foreign fishing going on, which is an unfortunate development. And it's up to the international community, in my view, to try to ensure that that come to an end. In some cases, the foreign fishing vessels are interacting with local Somali officials, basically buying them off in order to get permission to fish in these very rich Somali waters.
With the longest coastline in mainland Africa, these fishing waters are crucial for Somalis and Somalia. Berbera, in the Republic of Somaliland, is the main port for the export of livestock to the Arabian Gulf and North Africa. These exports represent 65% of the national income of Somaliland, the breakaway state to the north of Somalia that declared independence after the fall of Siad Barre.
marka dekadanu muhiimad weyn bay ugu tahay Afrikaba marka la eego waxay ku taalaa marin biyoodka ugu dhow ruudka ay maraakiibtu marto oo 6 saacadood kaliya ayaa maraakiibta gacanka martaa 6 saacadood kaliya ay dekadan ku soo bayri kartaa 6 saacadood kaliya soo shifta garaysa markay Berbera doonayaan halka ay dekadaha kale ee mandaqada ku yaala 100 saacadood iyo in ka badan ay maraan ay u socdaan marka ay doonayaan inay qabtaan waxaanu ka shaqeynaynaa 24 hours shaqada maanta dekada laga degi maayo ama maalin walba waa sidaas waxaanu adduunyada u dhoofinaa ama aanu khaliis ama aanu caranta u dhoofinaa xoolo nool oo ari leh oo geel leh oo lo' leh waxaanu u dhoofinaa xabkahan beeyada la yiraahdo waxaanu u dhoofinaa skin waxa la yiraahdo harag waxyaabahaas exportka noogu badan aanu imika dirno waana wanaagsan exportka dekada Berbera ay dirtaa
It's a bridge between Africa and the Middle East. Much of the oil that comes from the Gulf passes through Bab el-Mandeb between Djibouti and Yemen. Somalia is sitting at that gate. Everything that comes from the Suez Canal has to run by Somalia to the east. All the commodities that are brought from China and Taiwan and Korea and Singapore and Malaysia that's going to Europe runs through the doorstep of the Somalis. Okay, so geographically it's a very, very strategic location.
dhaqaalaha Somaliland waa lafdhabarta dekada Berbera waa lafdhabarta uu ku tiirsan yahay in ka badan boqolkiiba 70 ama 80 ayaa dhaqaalaha budgetka Somaliland
Berbera is one of the main reasons Somaliland has achieved a greater degree of prosperity and security than central and southern Somalia. But Somaliland has yet to receive universal international recognition, and so receives very little international aid.
haddii aanu nahay reer Somaliland amba aanu nahay regionka Hargeysa amba aanu nahay degmadan Dar es Salaam in si wanaagsan loo caawiyo oo aad si wanaagsan loo caawiyo arrimaha iyaga laga fiirsado oo la garaysa dadku ayna dhageystaan way dawladdeedu way taal daran tahay lama itiraafsana itiraafkiina iyo mudnaanta koobaadna waxa la siiyaa haddii la yiraahdo koonfur baa la siiyaa oo wax la mariyaa dhaqaalaha iyo wax kasta la bixinayo annaka wax yaro faraguudkooda hay'adda naloo soo mariyo ayaana soo gaadha sida ceel yaroo la yar qodayay iyo
So Somaliland, even though it is documented, it is admired, it is studied, but also it's not recognized.
They rebuilt that territory on their own. Nobody's recognized them. They've had very little international help. They did it from the bottom up. They devised a political system.
We don't get a penny of support, of aid from the other nations. because they say once we don't recognize you, it has to come through Somalia. And we say anything that comes from Somalia, we don't want to keep it. We can live, we can survive. We survived for 12 years. And we can survive for another 10, 20 years.
We are independent. We are independent. It doesn't matter whether they recognize us or not. We are independent. We have got our flag, we have got our army, we have got our police, we have got our offices. We are independent.
laakiin annagu kolka imika la eego xagga amniga iyo waxbarashada iyo deganaanshaha waddanka dee koonfurta la mid ma yihiin aad baan uga wanaagsannahay dowladdeedu way dhisan tahay ciidamadii baa dhisan wax kastaa dhisan amniga iyagu waa 100% ya kolka annagu saasaan uga gadisannahay laakiin waxaan u baahannahay in ama dalka nalo ama dowladda naloo ictiraafo in dowladdana naloo ictiraafo ya haddii la yidhaa wixii kolka dowladda naloo ictiraafaan wax walba helaynaa laakiin inta dowladda iyadu ay taa hoos joogto ya ما arrimaha iyagu ma turunturo baxayaan
Whatever feelings he has with the government, people accept that we must have peace. The peace we have here is people-owned, not government-owned, people-owned. People want peace.
There is traditional mechanisms of settling clan disputes. And that's what Somaliland engaged. A law, a traditional law, blended with Islamic law. So they come out of all that, they built a bottom-up approach, they built a state and a peace.
We had elections, all the elections here. In 2002, we had local government elections. 203, president elections. 205, parliament elections. 2010, president elections. I was a minister in finance of the last government. We lost the election. And the other party, Kulbiya, came to power. And the president is now from Kulbiya party.
dugsiyada Schools of Tomorrow waxay ka mid yihiin dugsiyada aasaasiga ah ee waxbarashada aasaasiga bixiya runtii la aasaasay 2000 dugsiyada Schools of Tomorrow waxay lafdhabar u yihiin qayb lixaad la kaga jiraan waxbarashada Somaliland waxa aasaasay aqoonyahan reer Somaliland oo aqoontooda dhaqaalahooda iyo kartidoodaba u horay inay ummadda reer Somaliland iyo bulshooyinka Somaliland aqoon tayo leh waxbarasho tayo leh oo wanaagsan iyo tarbiyad iyo akhlaaq wanaagsan inay u aasaasaan dugsiyada markaa 2000 bay aasaasmeen dugsigu wasaaradda waxbarashada ayuu si rasmi ah toos ugu xidhan yahay manhajka waxbarashada ee Somaliland ayuu bixiyaa iyadoo supplementary dheeraada oo waxa weeyaan la siiyo ka baxsan manhajka Somaliland waxa wax lagu bixiyo dugsigu waxa weeyaan mediumkiisu waa English ayaa lagu bixiyaa waxa dugsiga hadafkiisu yahay ardayga inuu waxbarasho tayo leh oo aqoontii maadiga ahayd helo inuu tarbiyadii akhlaaqdii diiniga ahayd inuu helo isla markaana dhaqankii Soomaaliyeed iyo dhaqankeennina inuu intaba goob ku wada qaato dugsiga cid kale oo caawisaa ma jirto waxa badan baa noo qorshaysan runtii waxa kamid ah dhismayaasha oo aan runtii jecelahay qaybo badan oo imika wali qabiya inaan sii dhamaystirno oo noo qorshaysan tahay
Mohammed Yusuf Jama's optimism is encouraging, but Somalia's future is still uncertain. While there is government, Al-Shabaab still controls many parts of the country, and clan militias compete with one another for power. The civil war caused hundreds of thousands of Somalis to seek refuge in the West.
At the time I was 5 years old, we had to flee our country immediately because of the war and came to Kenya, the refugee camps in the neighboring country of Kenya. And I knew, even though at such a young age, something was going on. You could hear, shootings, and you could see all these people traveling and trying to run away too. You hear the stories of the elders telling us about there was a civil war going on, people getting killed.
In the next episode of Somalia, The Forgotten Story.